Everyone in the city knew two things about Isabella Laurent. First, she was the only daughter of tech billionaire Charles Laurent. Second, no nanny lasted more than a week. Some quit in tears, others were dismissed within hours. At 9 years old, Isabella had already earned a reputation that intimidated grown adults. The Laurent mansion sat behind iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges, a place where silence felt mandatory. Inside, Isabella ruled with sharp words and colder stares. She wasn't loud or dramatic, she was calculated. If she didn't like you, you knew immediately. On Monday morning, another nanny walked out. By lunchtime, the housekeeper had resigned. By evening, Charles Laurent sat alone in his office, rubbing his temples in frustration. He had built a billion-dollar empire from scratch, negotiated with world leaders, survived hostile takeovers, yet he couldn't manage his own daughter. She refuses to attend tutoring, the head of household reported nervously. She locked herself in her room and told the piano instructor she was emotionally inefficient. Charles closed his eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like something she would say. What Charles refused to admit aloud was the truth. Isabella had changed after her mother passed away 2 years earlier. The warmth in her eyes had slowly faded, replaced by something distant and guarded. She had stopped laughing, stopped drawing, stopped being a child. The next morning, Charles made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of hiring another elite nanny with perfect credentials, he contacted a small local caregiving agency. "I don't need polished," he said firmly. "I need patient." That was how Daniel Rivera's name entered the picture. Daniel was 34, a widowed father raising his 6-year-old son, Mateo. He worked part-time as a youth counselor and occasionally took private caregiving jobs to make ends meet. His resume wasn't impressive on paper. No Ivy League degrees. No luxury references. Just consistent work and handwritten recommendations from families. When Daniel received the call about a short-term live-in position at the Laurent estate, he almost declined immediately. "Sir, I'm not a corporate childcare specialist," he said honestly during the interview call. Charles studied him carefully through the screen. "Good," he replied. "Neither is my daughter." Daniel arrived at the mansion that Friday afternoon, holding Mateo's small backpack in one hand. He had been honest from the beginning. He would only accept the job if his son could stay with him during the temporary arrangement. Surprisingly, Charles had agreed without hesitation. Isabella was waiting in the grand living room when Daniel entered. She didn't stand. She didn't smile. She simply observed him with sharp, assessing eyes. "You won't last," she said flatly. Mateo blinked beside his father but stayed quiet. Daniel didn't flinch. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "That's okay," he replied gently. "I'm not here to last. I'm here to help." Isabella raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Help with what?" Daniel glanced around the massive, silent room. "Whatever hurts," he answered softly. For the first time, something in Isabella's expression shifted just slightly. Not warmth, not trust, but curiosity. No one had spoken to her that way before. They had tried discipline, structure, control. No one had tried understanding. Upstairs, Charles watched the interaction through a discreet hallway camera, arms folded tightly. He wasn't hopeful. It stopped being hopeful months ago. But something about the way Daniel remained calm under Isabella's cold stare unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. Because for the first time in a long time, his daughter didn't look angry. She looked interested. And neither Charles nor Daniel had any idea that within 24 hours, Isabella Laurent would do something no one saw coming. The first 24 hours passed in uneasy silence. Isabella tested Daniel in small, calculated ways. She ignored his instructions, corrected his grammar deliberately, and informed him that the last 3 caregivers had cried before dinner. Daniel didn't react. He simply nodded and continued unpacking Mateo's small suitcase in the guest room. That evening, Isabella refused to join them for dinner. She remained upstairs, door closed, music playing faintly through the walls. Charles watched the situation carefully from his office, expecting Daniel to report failure before bedtime. Instead, Daniel knocked gently on Isabella's door. "I'm not hungry," Isabella called out coldly. "Figured," Daniel replied calmly. "But Mateo made extra spaghetti and he's offended you haven't tried it." There was a pause inside the room. A few seconds later, the door opened slightly. Isabella stared down at them, suspicious. Matteo held up a small plastic container proudly. "It's not perfect," he admitted. "But my dad says perfect is boring." Isabella blinked, clearly not used to being addressed by another child without intimidation. She hesitated, then took the container silently. Dinner was quiet but different. Isabella didn't speak much, but she stayed at the table. Matteo chatted about school and how he once got sent to the principal for climbing a tree during recess. Isabella's lips twitched briefly, though she tried to hide it. Later that night, something unexpected happened. The mansion's security alarm triggered at 2:17 a.m. Staff rushed through hallways. Charles stepped out of his bedroom, tense and alert. The disturbance came from Isabella's room. Daniel was already there. He wasn't standing outside. He was sitting on the floor inside her room, speaking softly. Isabella was curled up on her bed, shaking. "It's just thunder," Daniel was saying gently. "Storms are loud, but they pass." Matteo sat beside him, holding a flashlight under his chin to make silly shadows on the wall. Charles froze in the hallway. Isabella had never admitted she was afraid of storms. Instead, she usually reacted with anger, throwing things, shouting at staff, blaming others for the noise. But tonight, she wasn't shouting. She was crying quietly. Daniel didn't lecture. He didn't analyze. He simply stayed. "I don't like when things feel out of control," Isabella whispered shakily. Daniel nodded slowly. "Me neither," he admitted. "After Matteo's mom passed, I tried controlling everything. It didn't work." Isabella looked at him carefully, as if measuring honesty. "What did you do instead?" she asked quietly. "I learned that sometimes you don't control the storm," Daniel replied. "You just make sure you're not facing it alone." Matteo leaned closer to Isabella without hesitation. She didn't move away. In the hallway, Charles felt something unfamiliar twist in his chest. For 2 years, therapists had recommended techniques and structure. None had simply sat on the floor and listened. The thunder softened gradually. Isabella's breathing steadied. Eventually, she lay back against her pillows, eyes still open, but no longer panicked. Daniel stood carefully. "We'll leave the door cracked," he said. Storms hate being watched. When he stepped into the hallway, Charles was waiting. "She hasn't let anyone in during a storm since her mother died," Charles said quietly. Daniel met his gaze calmly. "She didn't let me in either," he replied. "She just needed someone willing to stay outside the door long enough." Charles studied him carefully, seeing not a professional caregiver but a father who understood grief without turning it into weakness. Upstairs, Isabella lay awake, staring at the cracked door. For the first time in 2 years, she hadn't felt alone during the storm. That frightened her more than the thunder ever had. The next morning, Isabella acted as if nothing had happened. She walked into the breakfast room, dressed neatly, posture straight, expression unreadable. If anyone had mentioned the storm, she would have denied everything. But Daniel noticed the small change. She sat closer to the table, not at the far end like usual. Matteo was already there, carefully building a tower out of sugar packets. "Your house is cool," he said casually, "but it echoes too much." Isabella frowned slightly. "It's designed for acoustics," she corrected automatically. Matteo shrugged. The word lingered longer than expected. After breakfast, Isabella attempted another test. She announced she would not attend her scheduled tutoring session. "It's inefficient," she stated firmly. "The tutor repeats things I already know." Daniel didn't argue. He simply asked, "Then what would feel useful instead?" Isabella blinked. Adults usually responded with authority, not questions. "Useful," she repeated. Daniel nodded. "If you're bored, maybe the problem isn't difficulty, maybe it's purpose." She studied him carefully, searching for hidden sarcasm. There wasn't any. An hour later, instead of traditional tutoring, Daniel and Matteo joined Isabella in the library. "Let's build something," Daniel suggested casually. Isabella raised an eyebrow. "Build what?" Daniel gestured toward a whiteboard. "Anything that solves a problem," Matteo immediately shouted. "A robot that makes breakfast?" Isabella rolled her eyes, but she didn't leave. Within minutes, she was sketching designs with sharp focus. Her mind moved quickly, outlining mechanical arms and timed heating systems. Daniel watched quietly. He wasn't impressed by her intelligence. That was obvious. He was watching her expression. For the first time, her face wasn't guarded. It was alive, focused, curious. Upstairs, Charles reviewed security footage again. this time not out of suspicion, but confusion. His daughter was laughing, not loudly, but clearly. He paused the screen, leaning closer. He hadn't heard that sound in years. By afternoon, something shifted again. Isabella received a video call from a former tutor she had openly mocked weeks earlier. Instead of ignoring it, she answered. "I have a design idea," she said quickly. "I'd like feedback." The tutor looked stunned, but nodded immediately. Later that evening, Charles approached Daniel privately. "What exactly are you doing?" he asked carefully. Daniel considered the question. "I'm not trying to control her," he replied. "I'm trying to understand what she's protecting." Charles frowned slightly. "Protecting from what?" Daniel met his gaze calmly. "From feeling small," he answered. "From feeling like she lost something she can't rebuild." The words hit deeper than Charles expected. For 2 years, Charles had tried filling the silence with luxury. New piano, new travel, new tutors. But Daniel had filled it with presents. And presents couldn't be purchased. That night, Isabella approached Daniel in the hallway unexpectedly. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. "That's what I've been told." She hesitated before asking, "Are you going to leave too?" The vulnerability in her voice was subtle but undeniable. Daniel crouched slightly to meet her eyes. "I only leave when I'm not needed anymore," he replied honestly. "And even then, I don't disappear." Isabella nodded slowly, absorbing that promise carefully. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was steady. Upstairs, Charles stood alone in his office, staring at an old framed photo of his wife and daughter. For the first time, he wondered if the solution had never been stricter control. Maybe it had always been connection. And the impossible part. Isabella Laurent, who no one could manage, wasn't being managed at all. She was finally being understood. The real test came sooner than anyone expected. High-profile guests filled the grand dining hall, voices polished and measured. Normally, Isabella would either refuse to appear or intentionally disrupt the evening with sharp remarks. Charles prepared himself for embarrassment. Instead, Isabella walked into the room calmly, dressed elegantly, but without her usual defensive posture. She didn't cling to sarcasm. She didn't hide upstairs. She stood beside her father, quiet but composed. Daniel watched from a distance, not interfering. Midway through dinner, one investor made a careless comment. "You must be proud. Your daughter will inherit all this," he said lightly. "That's a heavy crown for a child." Isabella stiffened, eyes darkening slightly. In the past, that would have triggered cold detachment. This time, she answered differently. "I don't plan to inherit it," she said evenly. "I plan to build something better." The table fell silent for a moment before several guests nodded in impressed agreement. Charles stared at her, stunned. After the dinner, Charles found Daniel on the balcony overlooking the city. "You didn't coach her," he said quietly. "It wasn't an accusation, it was realization." Daniel shook his head. "Yeah, she didn't need coaching, she needed confidence." "Shh." Charles exhaled slowly. "I've spent 2 years trying to protect her from pain," he admitted. "And somehow, I only made it worse." Daniel leaned against the railing thoughtfully. "Can't remove pain," he replied. "You can only show her she's strong enough to face it." Inside, Isabella was sitting on the living room floor with Matteo, examining the half-built prototype of their breakfast robot. She was explaining torque and balance patiently, not dismissively. Matteo listened with admiration instead of intimidation. Charles watched from the doorway. For the first time since his wife's death, he didn't see a broken child guarding herself. He saw a girl rebuilding herself. Later that evening, Charles approached Daniel directly. "The position was temporary," he began carefully, "but I'd like to make it permanent." Daniel hesitated. "My son comes with me," he replied calmly. Charles nodded without pause. "That's no longer a condition. It's understood." Isabella overheard part of the conversation. She stepped forward, pretending indifference. "If he stays," she said evenly, "I expect intellectual stimulation." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's negotiable," he replied. The following morning, as Daniel prepared breakfast in the massive kitchen, Isabella stood beside him quietly. "You did something impossible," she said without looking at him. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What was that?" She finally met his eyes. "You didn't try to fix me." Daniel's voice was gentle. "You weren't broken. Isabella considered that carefully before nodding once. Upstairs, Charles made a call to his executive board, postponing several international trips. For the first time in years, his priorities shifted visibly. Wealth could expand globally. But healing happened at home. Weeks later, the Laurent estate no longer felt like a silent museum. It felt lived in. Laughter echoed occasionally. Doors remained open during storms. Isabella still had her sharp intelligence, but it was no longer sharpened as a weapon. And Daniel, the single father no one expected to survive a week, had done something no professional ever had. He didn't control the billionaire's daughter. He simply reminded her she was still a child.